Annie Carney, I'd like to begin with you. Is it possible the president views during a pandemic two different constituencies, his people, in quotes, and the rest of the people in the United States?
We saw him thinking about politics first with those Liberate Michigan, Liberate Virginia tweets today. He saw an opportunity there. Conservative media has been talking a lot about these protests, especially in Michigan, where the governor, Whitmer, has been talked about as a running mate for Joe Biden. So he saw a political opportunity there. But I think mostly what's motivating him right now is not my people versus other people in terms of who gets sick or doesn't get sick. I think it's me versus the governors versus China or the WHO or whoever else about blame. What's consuming him, according to people I've talked to who have talked to him or are in the administration, is not so much feeling the weight of this crisis on his shoulders, but real deep frustration about how he's being covered, how the narrative that he wants to set about his own leadership is not what he sees on TV and reads the newspapers. So it's really about credit. He wants credit for the economy when the country reopens. He doesn't want the blame on his shoulders for deaths that might happen after he reopens states if it was too early or if there's not testing. And that's why he's putting this onto the states now. It's really about credit and blame right now with him, is the division.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.